Welcome back. I'm Matt.
And I'm Eric.
And this is episode 2 of our podcast. Thanks for watching and tuning in. We hope that what we're talking about is important and at least interesting. We certainly believe it is. Interesting point. Yesterday was St. Patrick's Day, and I was completely oblivious to the whole day almost. In fact, sometime in the afternoon, a friend of mine out of the blue sent me a message that said, "Happy St. Patrick's Day." And for some reason, I was thinking St. Patrick's Day was the end of the month. I don't know why. I didn't pay that much attention to it. And it wasn't until I jumped on Facebook in the evening, like all of us do to unwind just a little bit, that I see pictures of green pancakes and realize what the heck I'd missed. But I completely missed the day. You guys did something.
Yeah, so my wife, just wait till you have more kids. You have one 4-year-old, right? Yeah, wait till you have more kids, because once there's a lot of kids involved, then it's obviously a much more. It's a big event, right? Every holiday becomes this big event, right? So my wife is all prepared, and we have this pasta for dinner with this green sauce.
Oh, cool.
Not the best to look at. Tastes all right. Super healthy, apparently, for you. But yes, we have this green sauce, green smoothies, right? Great dinner. But here's the thing, though. So I'm not. I go to work. I get up early. Head out the door. I don't even think about it, right? I'm just, don't even realize that it's St. Patrick's Day. Of course, my wife realizes this, and so as soon as I get home, all 6 kids, hey guys, go pinch dad, right?
Uh-huh.
And so I have 6 kids attacking me, and so what do? I go to the nearest marker, and draw a 4-leaf clover.
You weren't wearing any green then.
I was not wearing any green, so I draw a 4-leaf clover on my hand. Mm-hmm. My wife's like, how 6th grade of you? And I'm like, hey, it works. I'm willing to do that. So but before that happened, I was pinched probably about 50 times at least. And, with 6 kids, they have...
was one pinch.
Oh, there's no rules in our house. They just go after you. So anyway, I thought that is a great way to tie it in because to what we're talking about today, because I was pinched for something that I didn't even think about, I didn't even worry about. And all the time doing what we do, I talk to people that say, you know what, don't even talk to me about it. If I think about it, it's going to happen, right? Something's going to happen if I think about it.
Sure.
And sometimes we need that person to pinch us, to wake us up to the fact that there's not as much green in the world as we like to think there is, right?
Yes.
Yeah, you like that?
Yeah. And today we're going to talk about the green in the world, specifically the United States. So on the front, good tie-in. On the front here, you'll see that front computer, the national debt clock at www.usdebtclock.org is zoomed in just to the national debt. There's a lot of numbers on that screen. In fact, maybe I should show them all the numbers. Come around here really quick and let you see what else is on that clock. From there, you're not going to be able to see it. But again, you go to usdebtclock.org, you'll see the same thing we're looking at right here. But for the purposes of today's chat, I'm just going to leave this up so that throughout the conversation today, we can keep our eye on this number right here and see how much that changes as we're visiting. We did talk a little bit about it last week as well. You can go back and see what that number was last week. In fact, the clock allows you to go back in time. If it doesn't have the number on here, right on the clock, what that number might have been back in the year 2000, then you can use the upper left-hand corner. There's a debt clock time machine button, and you can go back to other interesting points in time. So there are 5 areas, just 5 numbers that I want to just talk briefly about for the next few minutes. We're going to talk about that big number you're looking at right now, and how that is divided up per citizen and per taxpayer. Then we'll talk about the U.S. spending and the U.S. deficit, the annual spending and the annual deficit, and why that matters. We'll then talk about the workforce in the U.S. and how that's changed over the last 20 years and what the workforce might look like going forward into the future and why that matters. We'll then talk about the money supply. On the debt clock, it's called the M2 money supply. We can put a link down in the comments, someplace you can read more about what the M2 money supply means. We'll just touch on it briefly today. And then down at the bottom of the debt clock is something listed out as the unfunded liabilities of the United States and what that means. Now, Reason I want to bring this to conversation is that a lot of people need that pinch to wake up and realize there's not as much green in the world.
I think just to point out that that debt right there, I think maybe we should have people try to pronounce that number. Is that,
If you read that out loud, right?
Try to read it out loud, right? So I think that you know it better than I do, so I'm gonna try to read it. It's 28 trillion, right? 65 billion, 718 million, 500 and some odd
Almost
thousand.
six.
Now it's at 8. Now it's 8.
Yeah. And when I ask folks, one of these days we ought to take the time to just go out on the street in the summertime, talk to the people out on the street and ask them what the national debt is, what it looks like. And at first when I used to do that, I think I was surprised. And I've become less surprised over the last 4 years as I've talked to people about this. Most folks have no idea how many trillions of dollars of debt we have as a country. Most of them don't know that it's in the trillions. One of the reasons some people do know is because back in 1992, this book was written entitled Buying America Back. If you look at the cover of this book, you see a debt clock. This is a picture of the debt clock as it sat in 1992. Not on the internet, but outside of a building, if I remember correctly, on Wall Street. I forget the corner, I forget the intersection, but I'm going to read just a paragraph in this book. In April 1992, when the national debt clock was photographed for the cover of this book, the debt stood at $3,629,198,298,300. The average share for a family was $51,012. At the time the book went to press on July 13th, 1992, just a few months later, the debt was at $3,973 billion. A few months prior to that, it was $629 billion. So the fact that the debt has been going up shouldn't be news to anybody, but it barely makes it into the news because it's been on this trajectory for a while. This was 1992. That debt clock grabbed attention when the owner of that business put this huge digital clock, 6 feet wide digital clock, out on the street. It got a lot of attention right away. And people paid attention to it. So every now and again, somebody tells me, yeah, I think the debt's around 4 trillion. I think it goes back to what they saw back in the early and mid 90s when people were thinking it was $4 trillion. They don't realize how much it's gone up. Certainly, folks don't realize the reasons why it's gone up, nor the implications of it going up as much as it has. So that's something we wanted to talk about. The amount per citizen was 5,000 at the time this was written. I'm sorry, 51,000. It's now 84,000 per citizen, not just per family, but per citizen. Not per taxpayer, but per citizen. So that includes my 4-year-old son. It includes your 6 children per citizen. Per taxpayer, the debt is 223,000. Did I say trillion? 84,223,000 per taxpayer. All of us recognize there's fewer taxpayers in the country than there are citizens in the country, either because they're young or they're retired, they're just not paying taxes anymore. Okay. So let's move on to the next portion I wanted to go over, is the spending versus the deficit. This helps us understand how the debt has grown as much as it has. Because every year, for quite some time now, the president approves a budget that Congress puts together. And that budget is in the red, to put it simply. It was only a few years ago, a handful of years ago at the most, I think, that the annual deficit hit $1 trillion. Prior to that, it had been 500, 600, 700 billion. But boy, when it crossed $1 trillion, people were up in arms about it. And people like to blame that on the man in the White House. The man in the White House, though, if he doesn't sign that budget, then what happens to the government? Do you remember?
Shuts down?
Yeah. And we've seen government shutdowns in late January, February for that very reason. So that overspending by Congress, frankly, is what puts us here most of the time. If we look at the debt clock, I'm not going to scroll down on the computer out front. The spending sits at 6.7 trillion right now, and the deficit is 3.2. Not just one any longer, but 3.2. A lot of this actually has to do with the recent stimulus packages. Okay.
Better make sure this is not going to turn off on people.
Yeah,
there we
bad
go.
news there. Okay, so next item I wanted to mention is the workforce. According to the debt clock, there's 150,000 people in the workforce right now, paying taxes, working, producing a portion of what's called the GDP. When it comes right down to it, gross domestic product of the United States, that's carried by the people who are working in the United States. A lot of you, us, right? Because even though somebody like Elon Musk is out there building rockets, he's not the one actually building those rockets. If he sells his goods and services to somebody else and that's exported to some other country, it's because workers built those things. So we have to pay attention to the number of workers who are producing the gross domestic product of the United States. And that workforce, in 2000, it was 158,000 people, and now we're sitting at 150. So if we have increasing debt and declining workforce, that spells bad news to me. Unless those people per worker are producing greater GDP than they did in the past, significantly greater, then our GDP won't be able to keep up with the spending. That's one of my biggest concerns.
You know, I actually have something that I was looking up just this morning, something that really ties into that. And this is, I was really surprised at, now this is from the source for this is the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, right? So this is, I was looking at this and I thought, man, this is right there in front. You know, people would just take a look, would just do the research. It didn't take me very long to find this. And it says, large amounts of the government can crowd out private investment as budget deficits exert upward pressure on interest rates, right? So it's a lot of big words. Maybe sometimes it's a little hard to understand, but what it goes on to say here, I think is really worth understanding and really worth taking some time to know. It says, if the government borrows large amounts of money, there is less for everyone else, and interest rates tend to rise. Some private borrowers might not be able to afford the higher interest rates. Of course, many other factors influence this, right? Such as the growth of the economy and expectations for inflation. So in other words, we know that the debt is a big player in this realm of interest rates and how well the economy is doing, right? If the economy is doing really well, then you know, debt isn't as much of a factor. But as soon as the economy plummets,
Debt stays there.
the debt can really have, you know, create a lot of problems. So,
And increasing interest rates on the debt. If the interest rate on a number that large goes up, that puts some strain.
which we know is happening, right? So this is the cool thing. So I looked up, well, why not print more money, right? Everybody says, well, we're just going to print more money. So it says first of all, the federal government doesn't create money. That's one of the jobs of the Federal Reserve, the nation's central bank. The Fed tries to influence the supply of money in the economy to promote non-inflationary growth. Now, this is something that's really cool to understand. It says, unless there is an increase in economic activity commensurate with the amount of money that is created, printing money to pay off the debt would make inflation worse. This would be, as the saying goes, too much money chasing too few goods. So in other words, we've had a great economy, as is seen by the interest rates, right? Interest rates have been low. Even though our debt has been astronomical, interest rates have remained low. So that's kind of an indication that the economy has been doing pretty well. You know, if you look at the stock market, you can see that the stock market has reached all-time highs. So another indication. But what happens when the economy suddenly doesn't do as well? And I thought, you know what? If the economy is, how do I say this? If the economy started to not do so well, and interest rates went up, and the government began to crowd out private investments, wouldn't that mean that they would have more control over our lives?
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
If it's harder for us to, well, Quick comment on the interest rates. Sometimes when interest rates, borrowing interest rates go up, oftentimes the interest rates that we're earning somewhere else goes up. Not always, but sometimes, and they'll offset each other a little bit. But you're absolutely right. It's hard for a lot of Americans to borrow money that they sometimes need to buy a car, to repair a furnace, or some of these normal things that happen. It's tough for folks to get that money, and you're right. If the government borrows a good chunk of that, then what's left is going to be sold at a higher rate, right? That's what you're getting at.
Yep.
And the government approves a certain inflation rate, or they give control to the Federal Reserve Bank, the private bank that we call the Federal Reserve. The control is turned over to that banking institution to control the inflation rate. And sometimes that gets messed with a little bit, particularly when stimulus packages are passed. That money to fund those packages is printed out of thin air, essentially, backed by the debt of the United States, or the American people back that that new money with debt. That's a topic we're going to have to get into a whole nother time. But it's a scary thing, isn't it?
Yeah. Oh,
And hard
terrifying.
for folks. Yeah. Part of the idea, the reason that we're doing this, is to talk to people about being responsible with their money, to find a place to save their money so they have access to it. Because when times are tough, it is harder to go and borrow money. But if we all have a reserve of our own money and we don't need to borrow it so much, we're going to be so much better off. Mm-hmm. We're going to be free. And last time we talked a lot about how over the years, we've abdicated a lot of our responsibilities to the federal government and the state government in some senses. We rely on the state government, for example, for our pension programs oftentimes. And you look through the news and all those pension programs aren't doing so hot. It's a scary thing for sure. This kind of brings us to this next point, talking about the money supply. From year to year, there's a little bit of an increase in the money supply. This last year in particular, there's been a larger increase because those stimulus packages have been passed. And when Congress passes a $1.9 trillion stimulus package, we have to ask where that $1.9 trillion comes from. It's not sitting in the coffers of the federal government just waiting for somebody to spend it. It's not stored and tucked away for times of emergency. It literally is printed out of thin air. When that money goes to the economy, it normally goes to the banking institutions and it's lent out. With these stimulus packages, they were sent directly to taxpayers. It's still money that has to be paid back. It's added to the debt. We touched on this a little bit last time. The fact that over the last year and a half, we've added $5 trillion of debt to this number. A lot of that's been because of those stimulus packages. So when we look at this debt clock and we see the M2 money supply about halfway down that debt clock, towards the bottom of it, it looks like, the money supply in the year 2000 was $4.7 trillion. The money supply now is $19.9 trillion. That's almost $15 trillion of extra money, currency, that has been pumped into the economy over the last 21 years. It's not because our government found a gold mine somewhere and created some money, but it's just printed and pumped into our economy over the last 20 years. Let's talk about inflation, just real brief. When you think of inflation, what comes to mind? How do you notice inflation? How do you feel inflation?
Going to the grocery store, gas prices, I think is a big one, right? We've
Okay.
all seen gas prices
Okay.
go up recently.
Okay? You see prices go up, generally speaking.
Yeah.
Most people connect that with inflation. There's another way to look at inflation, and it is the literal inflating of the money supply. Now, think about a pitcher of Kool-Aid. We mix it up according to the directions, and everything tastes good. We all love Kool-Aid. We've loved Kool-Aid since the 50s, probably. If you added 50% more water to that, it would dilute the Kool-Aid that's in that pitcher, right? And when we add more currency to the supply of currency, then each dollar that comes out of that pool of currency is now worth less than it used to be.
It's not like there's any more lemonade. There's still the same amount of lemonade. You've just added water.
Yeah, still the same amount. Yeah, we've increased the liquid without increasing the flavor.
Right.
Nutritional value or anything. So Part of that is prices changing over time. Now, there's some things like barrels of oil. Sometimes the price of a barrel of oil changes because of other factors besides the government printing money. But your normal day-to-day goods down at the store, a package of frozen chicken breasts, bread, milk, those kinds of things that aren't impacted, unless there's a cow shortage, that would drive prices up. But most of the time, those prices change because of inflation, not because somebody's necessarily charging more, but instead of charging $1 for a loaf of bread, because that dollar's not worth as much as it used to be, they have to charge $1.20 or $1.50 in order to get the same value for that loaf of bread, because each dollar is worth less and provides less value than it used to. I think about the timeline. It's one thing to go back 20 years and watch the numbers. It's a whole other thing for me to remember the legislation that was passed at that point in time and exactly when Alan Greenspan was speaking to Congress and saying those things. I have a video clip of him actually saying not to worry about the national debt because we can always print more money. And if that's the case, in fact, we were just joking about this last week. If we can always print more money without consequence, then when we recently passed the $1.9 trillion stimulus, why didn't we just round it up to $10 trillion? I think even the people who were doing this understand that you can't just print an incredibly large amount of money without consequence. There's a reason they stopped it at 1.9 trillion instead of 10 trillion. They understand that this is a bad idea. When the Fed says our target inflation rate is 2%, they realize that 3, 4, 5, and 6% inflation is bad. So they stop it at 2. They try to stop it at 2. So back to your question. What's the consequence of this happening? That's such a huge question. And I can't answer that in 1 minute, but I could say, generally speaking, the money that you earn will be worth less than it is today. And I mean that with every fiber of my being. The reason I have this money on my desk all the time is because this money is not simply worth less than it was when I got it 20 years ago. It is literally worthless. These coins were coins I carried in my pocket in Venezuela, and they were worth something. I could use them at the time. Venezuela, just the beginning of this month, put plans in place to publish a 1 million Bolivar bill. To give you context, this is a 5 Bolivar bill. If I had enough of these in my pocket, I could buy a soda with them. The just printed 1 million Bolivar bill is worth 53 cents. If you go back and look at old news stories 5 years ago, maybe, approximately 4 or 5 years ago, you would find news stories where people were taking these old bills and finding a use for them. They'd fold them up into cute little, not origami, but they would somehow thread them together and they'd make baskets and stuff out of the old money because it literally had no use. You could sell a basket made out of the money for more than the currency was actually worth. Generally, it will make your current money worth less than it was before. When Ross Perot was running for president, he was famous for holding up a sign at one point and saying, back in 1919, I think he said, when the dollar was worth $1, and people don't necessarily understand what he meant by that. But back then, $1 was worth $1. We think that $1 is worth $1 now, but $1 is actually worth like 10 cents or something. And we just don't think of it in those terms. But that's what inflation does. So think about retirement savings. We have to put our money somewhere so it will grow, so that if we have $10,000 sitting someplace over the next 20 years, when we need to use that $10,000, we hope that it still buys $10 worth of goods. But the way we're going, that $10,000 20 years from now might buy $500 worth of goods. What if we experience hyperinflation the way other countries have, okay? And then over a period of 10 years, the money that we have literally loses so much value that it is worthless. Now, the United States hasn't ever experienced hyperinflation, but we could.
You know, that just clicked something in my head. what you said earlier, how a lot of times people think about inflation in terms of the cost of goods, right? The cost of gas and so on and so forth. So we go to the grocery store and we look at, the cost of bread or milk, and we say, oh man, that's, the cost has gone up again, and that's why does bread cost more? Why do all these things cost more? I hate this. They're bringing up the cost of all these goods. Well, really, what's happening is it's not that the cost of milk is increasing; it's that the cost of the dollar or the value of the dollar is decreasing, right?
Yep.
And so they have to increase the amount of goods, the cost of goods, in order to compensate for the value of the dollar.
Yeah.
And so I think that's a great point. That the interest rates are really determined by supply and demand.
Yep.
And the
Cost of
government-
things.
Yeah.
If inflation was simply the price of something changing over time, then we would see the price of everything going up over time. But let's use examples of what we have right here. Buying this today, I don't know how old this is. This is a pretty new one, right?
it is.
Okay. So what if you had to buy a laptop 5 years ago that did what this one does?
Costs a lot more.
Lots more. This one right here, this thing is so fancy that the screen flips around on me. I can fold it all the way over. That thing didn't even exist at one point in time, right? Well, neither did that, but in recent history, this didn't exist. This thing right here, I was talking to a computer friend of mine. He tells me that this phone right here has more computing power in it than a normal desktop computer might have had 10 years ago, okay? And this costs less than that did. So a lot of things cost less than they used to. Some things cost more. Some things have a cost that's based on supply and demand. Barrels of oil, for example. So inflation is not just the price of things changing. I want to touch on this more next time, because over the long term, what's happened in Venezuela has happened over the last 20 years. That's when I had this money in my hand and it was useful. If we fast forward 20 years in our country, we're not going to get to that fifth item I wanted to mention, the unfunded liabilities. That's long-term debt. For the sake of simplicity, this is short-term debt. Unfunded liabilities on that debt clock are long-term debt. And the long-term debt is going to be impacted by some of these other long-term consequences. To answer your question, Doug, a lot of what we're going to feel will be over the long term, not over the next 3 years. And so maybe we can table some of that for next time, talk about the unfunded long-term liabilities of the United States, what that means for us, talk about inflation, what that means for us, and we can kind of start from there next time.
Great. And something else that I think we need to talk about next time is what's the solution? This is a lot of information and a lot of weight on our shoulders now, right? So what do we do about it? What is the common person, the everyday average Joe, what do we do?
Yep. Good point. That's the whole reason we're doing this. Thanks.
All right. Thanks for joining us.
We'll catch you next time.